the world here. Welcome to the K-State Research and Extension First Friday e-call on a second Friday in July. Nobody wanted to be at work on the day after the 4th of July. So the purpose of the First Friday call is to increase the local community's knowledge about the experts, the education, and the economic resources available to help small businesses and the communities who love them. As always, the call is being recorded, and you will get a link to the website when it's posted and a copy of the presentation deck. And I would very much like to know if this call matters to you and why. And at the end of the call are 3 short survey questions. Did you learn something today that you can use immediately? How many people will you forward this information to? And what did you learn today that was most helpful to you? So I appreciate your just a moment of your time afterwards to tell us that answer. And we're ready, Ben. That's all. With no further ado, I introduce Ben Winchester, a rural sociologist from the University of Minnesota. And if you have never heard Ben before, you're in for a treat. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.
Go away.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. Really, hi, everybody. My name is Ben Winchester. I work for Extension, and I'm in a different department. I think Extension's very popular, family development, youth development, 4-H, all that, but we're in an area like Nancy called Community Vitality. We actually renamed ourselves to be Community Development, Department of Community Development. So now we do focus on community economics, leadership, civic engagement, and tourism across our rural communities. And really, I would say we reflect the new rural. And my own life is, my background is I grew up in Winona, southeastern Minnesota, what I thought was a small town of 25,000 people. When then I went to Morris, Minnesota to school at the University of Minnesota, has an auxiliary campus there in a town of 5,000 people. And that's when I was like, oh my gosh, I love small towns. And so I did. I started to learn. My undergrad was in math and stats. I'm like a data geek. I love data, but I know most of you hate it. So hopefully everything you hear today will be consumable and understandable. And, that's our goal here in Extension, is to kind of extend the knowledge that we learn about and of the university out. So with that, I've been doing a bunch of research around what I call rewriting the rural narrative. And that is the premise of all my work, is that the narrative we're using to describe our small towns is terrible and based upon things that happened 50 or 100 years ago and really don't reflect like all of these patterns that have happened pretty recently, relatively recently. And I would say relatively recently, since 1970, the year I was born, all of the trends that I see are generally fairly positive. We are durable, we're desirable, we're more diversified, and I'll portray some of this here. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to do this a little bit different. Hopefully, typically when we do PowerPoints, it's like, oh, stare at a PowerPoint, but you're going to be able to see me. So I'm right here. Hello, everybody. Again, what I want to call this is a focus on housing specifically. And what I want to talk about is people that move in, people that move out, and people that move over. But really what this comes down to is we've got a lot of dynamics in our communities that are the result of private action and private, more importantly, inaction. And let's talk about how these broader trends are going to impact whether or not you can bring in jobs. Like, we've got goals of creating jobs at our county, like, good luck. We've got jobs already. Like, you don't need to create jobs. We need people to fill these jobs. So so my focus today is mostly on rural. That is my wheelhouse. I don't really look at urban dynamics at all. So really the narrative that's out there, there's a brain drain, our kids leave, our 18-year-olds leave, like, true, that happens, but it's not because we're totally, undesirable places. It's because all kids, a lot of kids are like, I want to get out of here when they're 18. And so what are you going to do? I mean, it's not a measure of failure when your kids leave. It's a measure of success. Ask your teachers. You can tell your teachers you're a big failure because your kids end up leaving town. Like, we've got to watch how this narrative kind of influences how we talk about our people. So again, we have a narrative about we live in the middle of nowhere, that, we live in a sleepy town that was woken up by the blank and like woken up by the tornado or the whatever, right? But again, the implication here is that you were sleepy. Like, come on, get over this. Or that you're dying. This is very common. And we think that all our towns are on the verge of death, or that we're about to, close up shop. I just had somebody yesterday who say we're going to collapse. Towns of 15,000, we're going to collapse in the next 20 years. Like, I think we have to be extremely careful about the language that we use in describing our small towns and rural places. And we have been through all these dramatic changes. We're not going to get into that today. I've got a whole nother presentation just on how this narrative gets built, where it comes from, all these components of it. We're not going to talk about that. It's here, this narrative that we're trying to counter. One of the issues that we look at, one indicator of our decline is population. So again, typically, a lot of times I'm a data person, new census data comes out and everybody's like, oh, get the, new census. Did we grow? I hope our population went up. That is total population infatuation. If you are infatuated with your total numbers, like we're looking at things wrong. And I'm going to tell you why. I call this the Ricky Bobby approach to population growth. So if you saw the movie Talladega Nights, Ricky Bobby is a race car driver, and his dad told him, when it's not a documentary, it's a comedy, but his dad told him when he was younger, like, if you ain't first, you're last. And we kind of do that with our population numbers, like, oh, we grew, but not as much as our neighbors, or like we didn't grow at all, and now we're stagnant, right? We use the word stagnant all the time, even though that implies, what's the implication? Nobody ever comes and goes, but we know there's always people coming and going. Let's look at who is coming and going. So a lot of times we do have this narrative built around total population. And in fact, West Central Minnesota, and this is no different than Kansas here, but this is like one of the first charts where you're like, huh, this chart should make you say, huh. Like, here it is. The population in the West Central Minnesota region of 5 very rural counties, not as rural as some of the Kansas counties or Nebraska counties, right? But fairly rural. Rural counties, the total population from 1960 to 2010 went down by 35%. They're total losers, right? And the Ricky Bobby approach. And so now, but if you look at the line right under that, the number of households went up by 3%. How can that be? How can your households go up, but your population looks like it's in free fall almost? You would think nobody's living in our small towns anymore. I'll tell you why. It's because the composition of your households is smaller. The average household in 1940 was 3.6 people. Now it's down a whole person. You're going to lose 29% of your population just by doing nothing except existing in the modern world, because the average number of people in every home has gotten smaller. It's not a blanket everybody's leaving. It's a blanket the average size has gone down. This is crucial to understanding the dynamics around our change. So now what do we have today? Now, like, here's a scenario. What happens when your 2 kids graduate, or one of the kids graduates and leaves town? Your population just went down by 1. But your occupied households stayed the same, because that kid that just left didn't own that house. What happens today, more common? You have 2 seniors in their household, and one of them passes away and the surviving spouse stays in that home. And again, what happened to your population? Went down by 1. We call it the slow trickle of death in our rural communities, down by 1. But your households are still the same, because that senior is now staying in that home, right? So again, you have dynamics that work against that. But if you are a total population infatuation person, you're like, oh man, I can't let that empty bedroom sit there. I need a stranger to come in and think of what strategies you would actually come up with if you're just trying to keep your numbers up. Like, you're going to be trying to fill all these empty bedrooms that the kids just graduated from and the seniors passed away through. So not really, right? I mean, we don't ever want this. So again, you have a narrative that's built around this total population. Hello, losers, like Chase, Clay. I mean, you look at this is all tongue in cheek, right? So it is like you're a loser through population change in the rural narrative. But if you look at the housing changes, they're all very stable or growing. Ottawa County lost 6% of your population, but your housing's stable. And so how did we arrive at this point that we have such a negative narrative around doom and gloom and our places are dying, but on the other hand, I can't find a home to buy? Like, does that not make sense? So that is my number 1 response. Right now, our housing turnover is through the roof. The housing demand during the pandemic was accelerated. And a lot of people were during the pandemic were like, oh, isn't this going to save rural communities? And I'm like, we've saved ourselves, thank you. And all this did was exacerbate our home values through the already high demand for rural living. And just if you'd think there is no demand for rural living, I'm going to tell you there is. So we're going to talk about what that demand for rural living is. So, like in 2005, early 2000s, when I first started working back in Minnesota from Missouri, all we could talk about was workforce housing shortages. Like, man, what's going on? We're just short of workforce housing. And why were we short in workforce housing? Not because we're dying, it's because we're not. So a lot of times right now, we're confounding a labor shortage with a housing shortage. And we're like, oh, nobody wants to live here. We have all these jobs. Nobody wants to live here. Or the lazy, entitled people are being paid to stay home. Like, all these ridiculous arguments that come out of the side, when really it's confounding. Our labor shortage is the result of a housing shortage. There's nowhere for people to live. So I really want to shift our unit of success from people, population, to houses and households, and what that household looks like, and how those households have changed, and how the groups of households have shifted their preferences over the years. So with that, we do know there's people moving in. We've done studies in Nebraska, Minnesota, Montana, other states, South Dakota right now, around who's moving in to small towns and rural places, and we call it the rural brain gain. There has been a consistent pattern since the 70s of people moving into rural communities in their 30s, 40s, and up to 50s in a lot of places too. And why are people making this move? Simpler pace of life was number one. Number two is safety and security, especially those with children. And number three factor was the low cost of housing. A job was not in the top 10 in Minnesota. It wasn't in the top 7 in Nebraska or top 8 in Montana. Of course, people need a job, but it's not the primary reason why people are choosing to move to our rural communities. So we need to get past this economic development approach that the only reason that people are going to move here is because they have a job here. Hello, 1920. I can't even tell you how antiquated that perspective is at this point. We may need a much more diversified view of who is working here, who's living here. And I mentioned this in the pre-call with some folks, but even in Minnesota, I don't think I have the data here in front of me. In Minnesota, like just half of people work in the county they live in. People are commuting in and out all the time. I was in Riley County earlier this year. We saw all this commuting flows of data in and out of places every day. Thousands of people are crossing these boundaries. But meanwhile, we have jobs at the county level, and we're trying to achieve outcomes for the county, right? Well, good luck. That's not how people live. I'll just remind you that your county boundaries were drawn during the time of horse and buggy. They don't reflect how people actually live their lives today. But meanwhile, we're trying to achieve all these outcomes at the city, at the county level, and say, we got to create the jobs here. It's not good enough for it to be next door. Like, come on, we need to go. Anyway, the implications are vast for all this, especially about the people moving in, not always taking on a job. And again, so we did our study, our workforce mover, rural mover study a year before the pandemic in Minnesota. So this column right here is Minnesota a year before the pandemic. This column right here is a workforce mover study in Montana a year into the pandemic. So we're looking at pandemic-related influences of people moving in. And what we found is the percentage of people that said they moved because they had a job or a job offer in that community went down even further to just 1 in 3, from 40% to 35%, right? Which makes sense. A lot more people had an opportunity to work remotely. More employers offered the opportunity even for people to work remotely. And now people can activate their choice of not wanting to live in the metro. And they did. So they are moving everywhere and have been. This isn't even new. So what went up, though, is a percentage. So this is a big point for me. A lot of times people think that the only people moving into their small towns are the returnees. That is the people who grew up here, moved away, and came back. Because how else are you going to know about, Clontarf, Minnesota, unless you grew up here? You would never know about this town. It's like 200 people, right? Well, actually, just 1 in 4 newcomer households are from that community. 3 out of 4 are not from there in our studies, but that went up during the pandemic, and we couldn't quite figure out what happened. Like, how did the percentage of households that lived in the community before went up at such a dramatic end? It's because you have to understand the dynamics that housing was already full. How do you find a home to buy in a rural community? You have to know somebody. And so it was all about social networks. We found out when we interviewed all of these assessors across the states that 40 to 60% of home sales during the pandemic were not arm's length transactions. It was not a stranger selling to a stranger. It was like, oh, Cindy, I know your mom's looking at moving out of her house. We have always loved her house. We're taking you out for supper and we're just going to get this thing done. And that thing never hit the market. So this is this part and parcel of how this works. So again, it lived in the community before, you've got access to social capital. And we kind of tongue in cheek say, like, the best, you want to find a home to buy in a rural community, visit with your seniors after church. And you will hear about every house that will be coming on the market in the next 2 weeks. So what do we do about this demand for rural living? There is a high demand. Your homes are filled. Let's just build new homes. This presentation's over, right? Let's just build new homes. Like, we don't do this. Right? Building new homes for me is not an option. The number of contractors has declined in such great numbers that it is not even an option. Many communities do not have any builders available to them. So I want to shift our unit of, so not only building costs and all that. So I just want to refocus a little bit here and talk about this background. I want to talk about, like, you can't say you don't see this coming now after I talk about this, okay? Like this is going to be the biggest demographic shift we've ever had, maybe since the early 1900s when ag got mechanized, but since 1930 especially. But what's coming to our rural communities? So I don't know if you remember, but we were in 2010 and 2000, even between that time period, we were always talking about like the grain of rural. The grain of rural, right? And it's a percentage of homes that are occupied by people over the age of 65. And of course, you're the big winners and the people over the age of 65 that are occupying your households. More than a third of homes are occupied by people over the age of 65. So if all your economic developers typically care about are the people employed in the workforce, you're missing all the people who were in the workforce and now currently are providing a large economic benefit to your community. We'll talk about this in just a few minutes. But really, this grain of rural from 20 years ago is now shifting because the grain of rural is happening. I wanted to share this. Like when we look at the differentials of baby boomers and people over the age of 65 in our most urban communities to our most rural communities, the percentage of baby boomers is about the same in rural and urban communities. What's different is in our more rural communities, we have a much higher percentage of people over the age of 65, a third, right? But in an urban community, it might just be 20%, sometimes lower than that. So really, these trends are happening in our rural communities first. And what is that? We're aging. So here's the profile that we had seen, and we were waiting for all these changes in 2020. And let's look. So in the year 2000, these are the baby boomers. This is home ownership by age, and these are the renters. I'm not interested as much in the renters. I am interested in home ownership because it leads to all these other outcomes too. So on the home ownership side, because it's a majority of numbers too, you tend to be in a state that has high home ownership numbers too. But what happens is these are the baby boomers. So demographically, in the year 2012, when this data first came out, we were watching these baby boomers move, right? Here's the boomers. It's because you know the demographic snake, the mouse and the snake of the baby boomers. It's like this huge little bubble. And then there's the Gen X like me that nobody cares about. And then the millennials are coming like, and they're huge after this. So anyway, here's the baby boomers in the housing stock. In the year 2010, there's a lot of people that own homes that are baby boomers. And in 2000, in 2010, they've aged, right? They were 35 to 54 in the year 2000. Now they're 10 years older and those bars keep moving, right? And now I was like, oh man, once 2020 hits, we're going to start seeing all these homes open up because typically people would move out. Well, let's look at this. So workforce housing shortage, like there's plenty of workforce housing. It's currently occupied by our seniors. And I was like 10, 15 years ago, like, man, a lot of these seniors are going to move out. We're going to be able to refill all this labor. Well, that was 10 years ago. What happened to the supply of labor since then? This chart, I believe, explains everything. If there's one chart I want you to take away from this, it's this. So historically in the past, when people would hit the age of 67, way on the left side here, this is the home ownership rate. The green line here, home ownership rate declines. People move out of home ownership after the age of 67. Sometimes up to 30% in our communities of our seniors would move out of their home and into something else. This generation today are staying in their homes. They are not moving out of their homes hardly at all. So really, when we look at the difference between these two lines, the difference between these two lines are all the people who would have moved in. The people who would have moved in and refilled our labor supply. So really, we do know that 58% of older adults haven't changed homes in more than 20 years. There is a dynamic around being stuck right now. And it's not always about being stuck. Sometimes there's, again, there's an actual preference for up to a third of these older people over the age of 55 to move over. But that has all been filled up. So my mental model of what's happened since the 1970s, our rural communities started to see this brain gain and filled up almost all of our vacant homes in the 90s. And they were filled with baby boomers. And then a bunch of their kids left. So it looks like your population went down, right? Because your kids left. And oldest people die, but which is starting to have an impact. So their kids left, population went down, these people stayed, primarily baby boomers, and now over the past 10 years, they've been retiring. And they've been retiring, and instead of, a third of them moving out of their home and opening up that home for someone else, they're staying there. And so for me, the greatest inhibitor of our labor force right now is our inability for seniors to move over, is how I'm going to frame this. So what we want to look at, and you can see this in the data, Ottawa County here in 2010, what is that? 47% of households were owned by people that were 65 and older, and the older baby boomers where now those populations are, these people just keep getting older. And when all you do is age people, you inhibit the ability for young people to move in. So it starts to decline a little bit. And it's not huge numbers, but it's enough to make an impact. We see it every day, and it confounds all our outcomes. So again, Ottawa County here, their example was their population went down by 6%. Oh, I can't see behind me, but their housing changes were flat even. They were dead even. So again, Jackson County, same kind of trends where you've got a growing, slightly growing older population. But again, you wonder why your school enrollments go down. Like, you haven't been able to welcome in new people for 15 years. And your school enrollments really have been fairly flat and sometimes even declining a little bit more. So school enrollments, they did go down significantly in the 80s and 90s. They did stabilize through the 2000s and 2010s. But again, recently now, we're starting to see this inability of seniors to move over as an inhibition for our school enrollments too. I hope this makes sense. So what we do know is that here in Minnesota, though, what used to be the graying of rural is now the dying of rural. Right? Here's that map from before about the graying of rural. Now we are seeing this turnover. The most rural counties in Minnesota and Kansas that have the highest death rate now have the highest in-migration rate. As people pass away, they are forced to move. Right. There's a weird way to say it, like forced to move out of their home. Like, there's dynamics here. So let's talk more about some of these dynamics. I want to talk about, like, it's not like these people go right to an assisted living facility. We're talking about a continuum of life before we get to this continuum of care. Independent living, patio homes, all this stuff. It's not about just, and again, when you talk about this, like, I don't even want to use the word seniors, it's people over the age of 55, because the moment I'm talking to an older person, like, hey, would you ever think about senior housing? They're like, well, I'm not going to go into the place where people are going to die. Like, like I want to be in a place with people that are vibrant yet. And so anyway, there's a huge thing to unpack here. And that is people intend to do things, right? And then what happens in reality? This is me as a sociologist. I love this because people live in a world of, expectations and what they expect to do. So really, let's look at retirement. People did not expect to retire until they're older. But in reality, people do retire. So less than 9% of people, when asked, said, I'm not going to, less than 9% said they were going to retire under the age of 60. But in reality, almost 40% of people do. So this is the differential between what you think is going to happen down the road and what you actually end up having to experience is a very different model. So I call it the policy of best intentions. And that is seniors, their policy right now is I'm going to live in my house forever. It's not really a policy. How do you ever make decisions at the local level about that? And while many Americans do prefer to die at home, less than a quarter actually do. And it's a disaster at the end, folks. It's a disaster at the end when you've done no planning. You have no choice, no control. We'll get into all this. This is terrible. So why do seniors not move right now? Why are that not moving out, right? And they say 90% of seniors intend to stay in their homes, but only 43% found it easy to actually do that, right? So they're making it work. And why don't people think about moving or even move the stress of moving, right? Oh, I don't want to lose my independence. I don't want to leave my community or leave my house. I've got ties to this home. It's fear of the unknown. And that is impactful, right? And we actually build in a whole age in place industry. We bring people their medicines. We'll take people to their doctor's appointments. We will do everything we can to ensure that that person is staying in their house. When actually, I would argue that age in place is being confused with age in our house, and it should be considered age in the community. We are investing billions of dollars right now to age people in these 4-bedroom, 3-bath places. Like, I'm going to put on a ramp, or we're going to update the bathrooms, we're going to do all this work, and then how long are they in there? And literally, they spend all this money, but it's a livability factor. So again, like, you get to this point with older people, like, hey, Ben, your mom's got to move out of her house. I'm talking to a real estate agent. My mom's got to move out. And the agent is like, you need to update your wiring because you have knob and tube wiring in that thing, and there's no way you can get insurance on that. And if you want a first-time home buyer, you've got to take care of that peeling paint because you can't have any peeling paint and be eligible for a first-time home buyer. And then my mom's like, oh, I just spent $15,000 updating the bathroom. I'm putting on the ramp. Like, I'm not spending more money on this house. What did you just do? That was not an equity builder. That was a pure livability expense. And it boggles my mind to think about the billions of dollars we're spending on this, livability expense when we're not actually invested in improving our infrastructure of our homes and our houses. I want to argue here that our house is a home when there's someone in it. Our houses have been homes to generations before, but I want to ensure our houses are going to be a home to someone in the future, because right now that's not a guarantee. What kind of shape is our housing stock in based upon the system that we're producing around that, right? So, but this really does, like, sometimes it's cheaper. It's portrayed as being cheaper to do all this age in-house. And there's incentives and programs to do so, but this really inhibits that in-migration. You can't welcome in new labor if you're just helping people stay in their homes for whoever knows how long. And meanwhile, you have employers who are like, I just watched 3 people retire in the past year and I can't replace any of that labor. What are they going to do? What are you going to do here? So there is the argument here that what happens when seniors do have to move? Everything is exacerbated. You want to talk about stress of moving? When you have to do it in emergency mode, it's way worse. All of this is way worse. You fear of losing independence? Good luck when you have choice. Oh, my mom didn't know that there was a waiting list for the independent living facility in town. Like, Cindy, you talked about this, right? The waiting list, like, there's no planning. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't use blanket statements like that. But I'm very frustrated by the inability of us to see our senior population as an economic driver for our communities. And it is. Health and education services are the top employers in rural Kansas by far. They make up a third of all your jobs today. So I do want to talk about what it looks like. So again, I'm usually a positive story person. I want to lift up the stories of all these people moving in and they love rural communities. They're moving here because they love it, not because they pity you, right? But meanwhile, here is where I want to lift up the stories of disaster, where my mom now couldn't live in Hancock. She had to move over to Starbuck, which was 2 towns over. And she doesn't see her friends but once every 3 weeks. Like, it is terrible, like the situation that people end up in. But ideally, nobody cares about housing. Like, even overall, I'm going to make this argument. Nobody cares about all the housing in your community. We have certain groups that care about certain types of housing, but there's nobody that has an overall purview of it, because typically, even with public agents, like, I'm not going to tell Nancy's mom what to do with her house, right? It's a private asset. Well, it's also a public good. And this is the rub. This is, how do you make the argument that this is a public good and that maybe we could actually invest in this? Because, or when people are in high quality housing or even non-dilapidated housing, their healthcare costs are down. Their graduation rates are up, right? There's actually why is public health decisions being made separately from housing decisions at this point? Because actually you have public health costs when the decisions on housing don't get made. So anyway, you guys may know some of this. What we found out, though, is that aging in your home long-term increases the likelihood that the dilapidated housing will increase. This is the fact. So now you can talk about, what is the impact of a dilapidated home? What is the cost, right? What is the public cost of private inaction is my main question here. What happens if your community only has 4 houses, all right? So there's 4 homes in town, but one year my neighbor's house has to be torn down. What happens then? So in this year, the year above, every house was bringing in $1,000 in property tax revenue. That is for the land and the structure on it. But now if my neighbor's house gets torn down, the structure is gone and you're only assessed on the land. So now what happens to that assessment? It went down from $1,000 to $200. Well, does the county say, oh, I know we had that dilapidated home, we lost $800 on that parcel, or we had to reduce our levy on that parcel by $800. Should we reduce our overall levy? Certainly not. Like, the county doesn't take that into account there. Who's going to pay for that other $800 reduction? Everybody else's taxes now went up because of that one private choice of a dilapidated home. And so you can go through the numbers and count through the number of homes that were dilapidated or torn down and estimate the effect on your property taxes. So now there is a public cost to private inaction, and maybe we should be concerned about what the general stock of our housing looks like and what condition that may be in. So, and then again, all housing is a concern for me, not just dilapidated, not just the LMI housing. All housing development is affordable housing. All housing development contributes to affordable housing. So with that, when we do talk to people about the equity in their own home is the #1 net worth asset that they've got. And so when I do talk to seniors about potentially moving over, it's like, well, my home's already paid off. Like, I don't want another mortgage. And it's not like you even get another mortgage. You could be shifting your equity into something different. You can be, so the idea here is that your home is probably the number one point of equity that you've got. So we do advocate for moving over, and this has been the biggest successes we've seen across the state and really across the country has been move over housing. Because when you provide that move over housing that was filled up in the 70s, 80s, you are now providing opportunities for this generation to move over. And when you move this generation out of this 4-bedroom, 3-bath places, you open up for your existing labor supply your labor shortage. So when seniors open up their homes for supply, it inhibits, you take care of this stress and fear. Like we've had developers all over the place realize that when they put up these kind of patio homes too, like they put them up and they're sold the moment they break ground. I mean, it's bonkers, just the demand for this. But typically, I'll say housing studies don't really talk about cohort changes. Housing studies talk a lot about workforce housing. And I would argue you have the workforce housing, it's currently occupied. So in reality, what kind of shape is it in? Now you have a scenario too, where like, what kind of shape is that house in? And maybe the person who's in that home right now is eligible for home rehabilitation grants, but the people who are going to be moving into it aren't, and they're like above the income level. So now who takes care of that house? What if my mom doesn't even see that program as something that's like reasonable to do, so she doesn't do it, but then she sells her home to someone who moves in who's right above that income level, and now they have to pay for that new roof, they have to pay for that electrical, they have to pay for the home rehabilitation by themselves, rather than having your community level take care of the housing stock. So this is kind of my argument. I'm just trying to build the unit of analysis up to our housing stock and look at who's occupying that housing stock and how does the inability of people to move inhibit the ability for other people to move in. The people are honestly waiting in line to move into our communities. So patio homes, these are the manageable independent living. So it is having conversations with people about this trend. So now we do need to make the economic case. Like, typically economic developers don't even care about seniors who are retired because they're not in the workforce, right? You want to care about your current employers and your current workforce. Well, I would argue that your retirees are getting delayed paychecks and they're still getting a pretty significant amount. So I want to talk about transfer receipts. Transfer receipts are old age Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These are transfers from the federal government to individuals. And sometimes it passes through the individual to the clinic, to the hospital, right? Medicare, Medicaid, or to the pharmacy or things like that. But ultimately, transfer receipts is a component of income in your community. Generally, when you think about all the income in your community, you think about a job. Well, jobs make up 55 to 65% of your income. Actually, there are other components of income that are major drivers of job creation even. And so Ottawa County, here, just 57% of all the income coming into Ottawa County comes in the form of a job through wages and salary. 25 or 29% of all the dollars coming in every month, every day, every year comes in the form of a transfer receipt. And again, that's just old age Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So that's, that 4-page or 2-page little flyer you get from the Social Security Administration. It's just that thing. It doesn't include private retirement accounts like 401ks, none of that. So imagine what your number could be if you actually included that in here, though I will say the generations that are retiring, even the leading baby boomers, don't have like private retirement accounts to the extent that the younger baby boomers and the people below them and after them do. So this becomes important to understand these kinds of dynamics. And let's look at Ottawa County. So, and these trends over time, it's been pretty consistent, but now since 2010, it's starting to have an upward trend. The percentage of income in the county that comes in the form of a transfer receipt is continuing to rise. So now, who are the primary folks receiving these dollars? It's your older population. So what happens then? If you do not have move over housing and your seniors need and your older people need to move over, they're going to move out and they're going to take these transfer receipts with them. Imagine today how many jobs you have, medical, healthcare, right now because of this one transfer receipt. So I would argue this is, as one of our economic drivers, the Fed Reserve out of Philadelphia will tell you it's an anchor economy around healthcare. And so we start to look at caring for people. Education and health services are our primary employers. So if you don't have move over housing, we're at risk of losing this income. So here's Clay County. Again, you see the bump. Everything is starting to rise in the past 5 to 10 years. We're starting to see a big jump. And I would expect in the next 10 years, this to be at 40%, especially like 40 to 50% in some of these places when you include private retirement accounts. So the dollars flowing into your communities are not just about the jobs. And so economic development for me is a full purview and also includes your housing stock, because that is where your older population actually lives. So again, you're trying to make the argument to to economic developers that they should care about housing. Like, it seems to be a no-brainer, but I need to continue to make that argument that there is actually, and we're not always talking about like company towns where they're building all the housing or things like that. We're just talking about what is the role of the public in ensuring you have a future for your town and a future for homes, people to live in. So really, we're going to have we already have a senior service economy, and your local economy is only going to become more integrated with senior and baby boomer related economic services. And we should, and I'll make a value statement here, like we should try to retain these transfer receipts. Like maybe we should try to keep these dollars around, because again, when you build move over housing, it's just not a one-off thing. It's for every generation thereafter. So this is a opportunity, but if you believe your rural communities are dying, why would you invest in death? Why would you invest in no future? Like, I don't have a narrative of doom and gloom. I have a narrative of people seeing rural communities as highly desirable and have been for the past 50 years, again, since I was born. So for me, all housing is the key. We build supply and workforce housing by making the existing stock available that we've got. So a house for me is not just a private asset. It's also a community asset that we hope persists over time. We do know that we're seeing a return. What does the composition of these houses look like when we have the substitutions, right? You're out with 1 and 2 person households and in with 3 to 5. So we do know that the top people that 26-year-olds lived with in 1968 was their spouse, and now it's their parents, right? So we're seeing all these shift. We're seeing a return to multi-generational housing. I can't even emphasize this one enough. Multi-generational housing is such a future for us. And I would say, and I would actually make the argument that the nuclear household, like I'm only successful when I'm by myself with my wife and my kids, is so 1950. Like multi-generational housing used to be how it was. You go all through the early 1900s, it wasn't until the 40s. So if this chart were to go back to all the 40s, 50s, 60s, or sorry, the 40s, 30s, 20s, 10s, you would see the multi-generational rate. So going where it used to be high. So now for me, it's a return to multi-generational living. You want to see the updated numbers? I think it's at like 23% now. I don't have the updated number here, but Pew Research Institute does these numbers all the time. So nuclear households, again, married with children. Sorry, I didn't do this very well. A nuclear household was 44% in 1960, and now that's down to just 17 to 20% in many places. So these types of dynamics are influencing how our communities have the potential to grow. You want to ensure you've got zoning that's open. You'll allow multi-generational on that. You can allow ADUs in town to have your mom stay with you, or have you move in with your mom, whatever that's going to look like. So, but again, the pandemic was like, oh my gosh, this is going to save rural. We're like, you're going to notice here that our rural communities, our home values just became exacerbated. So this isn't going to save us. We've already saved ourselves, kind of argument I've got, but we've got all these other related trends. So you do have to put some value statements out there. Do you value home ownership? Because that's not the trend. That's not the trend over ownership. We're seeing a trend in extra local ownership. I do transfer of wealth studies. So we're not going to get into the transfer of wealth stuff here, but I do a lot of transfer of wealth studies. And one of the bigger issues is that when you don't own the land, you don't appreciate the appreciation on that wealth when you don't own it. So there is a value around home ownership that leads to all these other outcomes too. So I do want to put a value statement on trying to improve home ownership rates and trying to ensure that the people who are homeowners can maintain that. But we do know we're up against institutional buyers. We're up against like groups unknown buying property because property is very lucrative in terms of long-term return. Airbnbs is pointed to as one of the big killers. Like, and again, imagine like you just have the one house next door turn into an Airbnb. There's 3 to 5 people that are unable to move in, unable to join your labor force. So you've got to make some decisions here about local control. But again, we tend to have a laissez-faire approach to housing. Like, I'm not going to tell people what to do with their private asset, but at the same time, it's a public good. So we need to balance this public good with the private decisions that are made at the local level. So what do we have? You can engage the people here. Or sorry, you can engage the house here. At what point do you engage like your community? Do you do vacant property? What about new property entering the market or leaving the market? At what point do you like intervene and see what kind of shape your housing is in to even know what kind of shape it's in. We used to have decennial census data that would give us really decent numbers on what kind of shape our housing was in 20 years ago. Census did away with all that. And in fact, the 2020 census housing data is so bad, I would encourage you never to use it. And if you want to talk about that later, we can. There are major problems with the housing numbers. They don't make sense. Anyway, with that, we do know that this is all new. Like a lot of times we don't have construction people. So I do talk all about like building your talent pipeline. I tell high school kids all the time, plumbers, electrician, construction, like you go into the trade, man, it is a gold mine right now. We are so short on trades and construction. So there is one chance you can get training in a couple of years and you could be out banking a good job pretty quick. But you need an exit plan because your body's going to get beat up. So have your 20-year plan to get out of that industry. So really for me, the talent pipeline is vital, and finding ways like South Dakota's got this Build Dakota, which they're offering scholarship funds to offer, encourage kids to go into these types of trade skills in their field. So one of the biggest pieces for me around community development is just engaging the people. And that is, right now we're not having these conversations, right? We barely have this conversation inside of our family. It's like, oh, mom, I could be like, hey, mom, it doesn't look like you're getting around very good in the house, and my mom's like, oh, shut up, I'm getting around just fine. And she's like, oh, shut up, I'm getting around just fine. She doesn't want to talk about like potentially moving out. But then she goes to the doctor in the afternoon and she's like, oh, I can barely get up and down those steps anymore. My hip is just, whatever it is. But meanwhile, why didn't you have that conversation with your son in the morning? You could actually have a conversation about what you intend to do. Because right now, what we find out is seniors do not have choice. They don't have control. The people over the age of 55. I have to be real careful. I think I use terminology. The terminology matters here a lot in terms of what people think you're talking about. So again, actually talking and having community conversations with our older population about their intentions of those in the house. What do you intend to do? What's the condition of that home? Can you do a pre-sale inspection for them for free with no strings attached, just so they're aware of what they can do to prepare themselves for the shift that's happening? So this is community development work. I know a lot of places have like assessments that we're trying to work in different ways, but this community development work, nobody wants to pay for this all the time. It's people work, and what people want to pay for outcomes. So I think we're always trying to shift the way that we talk about this in a way that we're talking about the public good. And again, we're trying to serve our public economy here. Again, we're trying to serve our overall system, not just an individual. Like, people say, I don't want to give Nancy's mom money. Like, we're not talking about that. We're trying to invest in our housing stock and our housing unit to ensure there's somewhere to live. So anyway, engaging with our people here becomes something we want to do. And then really for me, just engaging seniors and their families and start a discussion about housing succession. We have succession plans for businesses. Hopefully some don't. I mean, again, we hope they do. And we know there's a lot that should have them, but they don't. So I want to talk about succession plan just for our housing stocks. But part of this too is when I have these conversations with the older people, they're like, they don't really believe people want to live in their home. Like, and I have to remind them, like, we have people waiting in line that want to live here in this home that you raised your kids in this community that you have helped better for the past 40 or years or whatever it is. Like, there's a next generation coming in and they love it. They love your town. So my real strategy when I do rural narrative work is you need to get new people on a panel to sit them in front of all these people who might have a negative narrative and listen to the new people talk about how much they love your place. They will shut down any negative narrative in a hurry because generally people don't move because they hate you and that they're, again, moving for pity. They're coming because they're for hope and opportunity, right? So I just talk more broadly about community succession. Maybe one of the best things you can do for your community is ensure there's somewhere for people to live. And when we talk more broadly about this, it's about community succession plans for our homes, for our leaders, and for our businesses. So with that, I just really appreciate the opportunity to kind of share all this today. We don't have big educational programming in Minnesota about this. I just do applied research on a number of topics. And really everything you hear today is the result of folks saying like, what about this? Like I am totally I do an applied research agenda solely based upon the feedback I get. So with that, if you've got any ideas for an applied research project for us, and more importantly, if you want to see data for your county, Nancy, maybe we could add that in the survey, or maybe note that this will get you to do the evaluation. We'll tell you what, if you do the evaluation in there, ask or make a statement like, I would like to request data for my county, include your email. We'll try to parse that out because we do want your responses to be anonymous. I'm an evaluation person in extension, so I'm always trying to get good feedback, but I'm also trying to ensure people have a safe place to provide that feedback. So either if you don't feel like you want to include it in your feedback for the session, your name and the county that you want, go ahead and just shoot Nancy an email or me, but I think we should go through Nancy on this so she has an idea what's kind of going on. But I can happily get you your transfer receipt data, your housing, those kind of age profiles of the housing stocks, and the shift that we've seen since 2010 to 2020 in the proportion of older people. But primarily, this is a rural trend. Urban communities have a lot of different trends to them that I don't necessarily look at. So I just want to say, number one, thanks for your time here today. Thanks for helping improve your communities. I mean, you had to show up here, so I just want to say thanks for doing that. So, Nancy, I'll kick it back to you.
Ben, that's awesome. And we took from your conversation in Riley County last March the opportunity to brand our own version of your newcomers dinner. And when Ben talks about creating a format for people to say, there are people coming, and this is the format to do it. And so it's a very convoluted, long, I haven't shortened it yet. And I can't find my chat window. There we go. So if you want to find out how to host a newcomers dinner in that very long URL there, you'll see the link, and Ben invented it. And Ben, do you want to say anything more about that?
Sorry, I was muted there. Yeah, this is just a simple exercise that we do. Part of our argument is like newcomers don't always have an opportunity to engage with each other. I'm gonna stop my share here. They don't always have an opportunity to engage with others, and you might not have any welcoming activities in your community or whatever. But what we say is like we offer a newcomer meal. And it's just for newcomers. It's not for all the existing people to gawk at all the new people. It's like just for the newcomers. So you go in and invite people through real estate agents or your schools, or there's lots of different strategies you can find these new people and invite them in. And then all you do really is ask them to introduce themselves. And like, it's real simple. The number one outcome we see out of this is newcomers saying, I can't believe I'm not the only one. Because again, when you're not from that community and you don't know people, it's isolated, it's alienating. And if you're not welcomed, and if you're just like, man, Cindy, why would you ever move here? Like, that doesn't sound very good. Like, or we treat people like warm bodies. Sorry, Cindy, I don't mean to pick on you. Just I see your screen there. So. But yeah, this is we do advocate for this. Newcomer supper is a really good way just for newcomers to see each other, welcome them to the community. You might have local leaders there too, and invite them to participate in community groups. But that, like, really, we do these. We take people out for a meal. We have a grab a bite program too in Otter Tail County where you just take an individual out for a meal. But the rule here is you can't ask them for anything. Not like, oh, we have an open EDA board spot. Do you want to sit on the board? Like, don't ask people for this stuff. Like, they're brand new to this town. That is the last thing you should be doing. And if you truly want to engage people, it's like, oh, Nancy, we're having a fireman supper on Friday. Do you want to flip burgers with us? Like, engagement, small engagement. So it is. It's been super useful for us to just have people see, and then they are seen. And we've had things like newspapers or radio stations do interviews with these newcomers too, like every Friday at 10 a.m. There's, every Friday newspaper has a brain gain corner, they call it. So there's a lot of different avenues here to help shine the light, just not shine the light in a bad way, but just to show that your communities have been changing. It's not some stagnant place that everybody just needs to learn about. Like, you've constantly been changing and evolving over the decades. So I'll stop there.
So recently the Kansas Sampler Foundation has a tidbits about what they're learning as they go around the state. And one of the things they highlighted was a great website that had things for new residents. And I'm thinking to myself, lots of us don't even know what to highlight unless we're having dinners like that. We forget to tell people what's already here because everyone knows it, right? So
yeah, I'll just follow up on that. So a lot of times too, social life has changed a lot. I have a whole different presentation on community engagement. Social life is so different that it's like, oh, why aren't people at the Eagles Club? It's because they're mountain biking. Like they are all over the place. And so everything we've really shifted away from these kind of place-based groups more to interest-based groups that are regional. And so the nonprofit might not even exist in your county. It's like 2 counties over, right? So how do you even know to like recommend it to someone when you don't do it, nor do you even hear about it because you're not in the circle? So it is, again, it gets back to like, you don't know everybody and people just live separate lives and they don't overlap all the time. But it's a misnomer that you know everybody in your town. You may know of people, but you don't know them.
Right. Well, perfect. Do we have any questions? I want to open it up for a few minutes of questions. David Key is posting some announcements or some links to some announcements I'll make in a minute. But do you have any questions?
Could I ask a question, Nancy?
Yes, sure.
So Ben, I think one thing is, how do you overcome this thought of, you're talking about two people occupying a big house, but they have this status symbol of owning a big house. How do you get them thinking that I need to move over, but then I lose my status of owning a big house?
I don't know that I'm going to change their mind if they have status so high that I mean, I still go back to there's 20 to 30% of the population that wants to move. I'm like not trying to change people's mind that won't ever move. I, in fact, have had people walk out of my presentations because they thought I was trying to kick them out of their homes. And I'm like, I'm not talking about everybody like your generational house. I'm not talking about those. And so I'm not trying to like sell people on doing it, but I would argue that lifting up the stories of how that went wrong helps people, especially their peers, to hear from and watch what's happening to their peers before it's too late. I think that's when people do hear about that. I'm sure Cindy hears these kinds of stories all the time about like how this goes at the end. So for me, like I mentioned earlier, like I just want to lift up some of these stories of where things went wrong, kind of, and like, you don't have control, you really don't have choice anymore, especially when things are filled up, because you don't like you don't want to be old, but you do. You get old. Like, the reality is you're gonna age. So like this is the demographer in me is deal with it. Like you're gonna, I mean, that's my personality type too, but like you're gonna have to deal with this. And if you want to ignore it and stick your head in the sand, you can do that. But that's not the reality of how people end up having to make decisions. Let's look at that pattern that people actually go through. Let's lift up some of those stories and see what we can do to help alleviate some of the stresses and the burdens that people actually have to go through. Because it's a terrible situation. Story after story after story. It gets old. It really does.
Jay represents a district extension office, and I think our family and consumer sciences agents are perfectly placed for creating those programs. And Ben had one slide. I'm in what you would call a condo unit that we moved into at age 55, and Ben's slide summarized it perfectly. I can do it now while I'm healthy, or I can do it later when I'm alone, or I can do it, or I can make my kids do it for me. And I didn't want any of the alternatives. And it's probably the hardest thing I've done so far, except for grief over lost ones. But it is so freeing to be in a smaller place.
Nancy, if I could
Yeah.
comment, I noticed Ben had some data up there for counties in northeast Kansas. Nemaha, Jackson was a couple of them. What I've observed in these communities, I've lived up here all my life. The 2 generations prior to the millennials, they actually listened and they taught their children the value of an education, training to add value to your life. We have a lot of jobs in these rural communities, and years ago it used to be you didn't drive. How, God forbid, you drive more than 30 miles from home to get anything. This generation has the education. They found the good job in the small communities around them, not necessarily in their community, and driving doesn't bother them one bit. Holton, Jackson County, A lot of jobs, they leave every day to go to Topeka or somewhere else. In Nemaha County, we have negative unemployment. We have a lot of industry jobs, a lot of well-paying jobs. People drive. We have to bus people into the county in two of our larger towns because we don't have enough workers. And they gladly will get on a bus. They'll ride down here. They'll work. They get on the bus at 4. They go back home. A lot of our higher paid individuals in Sabetha and industry are engineers, mechanical engineers, drawers, those kind of people. They get well paid for what they do. They work in factories that are worldwide now in a rural community, and they don't have a problem with that because they don't want to live in the community, but they'll work there because they know their house is 30 to 45 minutes away and they're okay with that. So that's why this housing thing, everybody thinks we've got to have all these workers in our town. You can't physically do that, first of all. And why would I always feel housing is more of a entrepreneurial effort. If you want to build houses, you need to take that risk and not the government to build a whole row of houses and expect people just to flock there, because people now, they want certain things in their home. They want it built a certain way. They want it designed a certain way. And of course, it always has to look better than the neighbor's house. And cookie cutter housing to me just doesn't cut it anymore. I think there's a place for maybe cookie cutter housing for transitional housing for people, smaller homes, 2-bedroom homes, patio homes. I think those kind of things appeal because I can take the value out of my home, take it and buy a small home someday, and I'm good. So
exactly.
Because I'm never going to get old enough to live in a nursing home, so I don't believe in that.
Oh no.
Your policy
Okay,
of best
well,
intentions or worst intentions. You have the policy of worst intentions, I think.
Yeah.
I will say, I just want to follow up on that, David. The busing people in, we've got that in a number of communities in like northwest Minnesota, where you have like Arctic Cat and stuff. So what we're seeing now is its impact on tourism, because we're having some people stay in hotels because it's cheaper to stay in a hotel full time, and then add in the commuting and everything else. So they're living in lodging of hotel lodging and motel lodging. So ultimately, this is impacting our tourism now. The tourists can't even come up and stay because all the spots are being filled. It's lodging that's becoming filled up. So that's another just kind of thing to keep an eye on. It's interesting.
wow.
Thanks for your comments, David, really.
Thank you, Ben. I know there's probably more comments, and maybe we should call back Ben back in 2025. He's been here. This is his 3rd visit, but Ben, thank you. We always enjoy it. And as I said, the recording and the PowerPoint will be on our website probably later today if our webmaster is on duty today. But I want to tell you about some of the things that we've been putting into that David's been putting into the links. We have a remote work Wednesday on the 2nd Wednesday of every month. And this month, our topic is co-working space with Kelly Hansen. Connecting Entrepreneurial Communities is a brand new initiative. They have them in other states, but Kansas is doing our first ever. And if you want to host the June 2025 conference and your town is a town of 9,999 or fewer, you might want to apply by August the 1st. And that link is there as CEC host RFP. K-State Research and Extension is still teaching grant workshops. We have three of our 4 remaining workshops are now posted online. We're designing a 4th in December for an evening session, and that link has been posted. It's called Grant Writing Basics. And then it's $60 for 2 sessions of 6 hours, 6 hours total. And if you have an event that you would like to promote, if it's a statewide event, please send it to me and I'll put it in the first Friday mailing that goes out to about 1,400 Kansans every month. If you'd like to promote these events, those that I just told you about, please send an email to ksrecv@ksu.edu, and David has posted that link. Our call next month will be with author Doug Griffiths, the author of 13 Ways to Kill Your Community. And Doug is going to speak about the 7 essentials, which are practical next steps to a vital community. And I always like to leave with a thought for the day. And Ben, thanks so much for being here. And Ben's giving you his email. Feel free to capture that. If you want to capture the, if you need any of these links repeated to you, just send me an email. Our thought for the day is, if we are willing to step back from who we are, we can slingshot into what we want to be, who people need us to be. And that was written by Whitney Johnson in a book called Smart Growth. Thanks for joining us today, everybody.